Well, let's talk a little bit about that 13th and final colony, English colony along the Atlantic coast, the colony of Georgia, established in 1732. And as you can see here, the property claims of the colony, just like with most of the other colonies, extended all the way to the Mississippi River, even though England did not have control of the area beyond the Appalachian Mountains. South Carolina kind of got boxed in there. So, anyway, Georgia, named for the king, George II, remember it's always good to suck up to the king in charge, was established by General James Oglethorpe. So if you are familiar with northern Georgia, if you're from the Chattanooga, Tennessee area, you'll recognize that name, Fort Oglethorpe, right there across the border from Chattanooga. James Oglethorpe, as you can see, a general, a military man, who had become a member of Parliament by the 1720s. And as a member of Parliament, he wound up serving on a committee investigating debtors' prisons. So debtors' prisons, that's where, just like it sounds like, if you fail to pay your debts, you'll be put in prison until you can pay your debts because, you can't pay your debts because you're in prison. So it's kind of a vicious cycle. And in particular, General Oglethorpe felt that this was unfair because most of the people who wound up in debtors' prisons were farmers who had been forced off their land by the increasing urbanization of England. So he wanted to do something to make life easier for those people who had been in debtors' prison, because once they're released from prison, they are absolutely penniless. They have no land. Everything's been taken from them to pay their debts, and they usually wound up going to live in a big city with no way to support themselves, and therefore often fell into a life of crime. But he felt like that was something they were forced into by circumstance. So his idea of a new colony to be named Georgia was for the redemption of the worthy poor. That is an opportunity for poor people to have a chance at some land. Well, with his new colony, because he moved there himself to set this colony up, he banned alcohol, for one thing, and then he also banned slavery. Slavery was not allowed in the colony of Georgia. Oglethorpe had met a slave named Diallo from Maryland and was totally moved to pity by the slave's story of his experiences. So he said, no slavery in my colony. So that's probably surprising to you. Georgia, after all, is one of the places probably most closely associated with slavery and the South. But it wasn't always that way, at least not in the beginning, not for about the first 10 years. Now, the problem arose with the English colonists who came to the colony, many of whom were craftsmen or farmers and, the deserving poor, but who hoped to do better at some future point, who hoped to do better and be able to afford them some slaves, basically. And they were very upset about these restrictions. In fact, they referred to Oglethorpe as a dictator, and many of them left Georgia and moved to South Carolina, where they could have slaves. Oglethorpe refused to bend, however, but 1743 he left the colony he had founded because England was right in the middle of another war, the War of Jenkins' Ear that we'll talk about a little bit later on. And he returned to England to serve in the military there and never came back to Georgia. And as soon as he was gone, the restriction on slaves was lifted. So then, lo and behold, there you have it, 13 English colonies. Well, now let's take a closer look at just who exactly the inhabitants were of these 13 English colonies. So we'll start by taking a look at the ethnic backgrounds of the population. So this map of the colonies is color-coded, and each color corresponds with an ethnic, national, or racial group, and it signifies which of those groups had the largest representation in those areas. So the pink, if you'll notice there, that from north to south, pink is the most common. It's kind of holding everything together there. All those pink areas are the areas where, in square mileage and so forth, population per square mile, that English people of English descent, are the largest group. So that's not surprising, since these are English colonies, that there'd be a lot of English people. However, there's other groups represented, and in certain areas represented more than the English. For example, the red areas there, those are the places where there were more people of German descent than there were English. And that's in Pennsylvania and down into Baltimore, other parts of Maryland, and then a little strip along the river up there in New York State. If you'll notice up there also in New York State, there is a narrow vertical strip that is kind of a greenish color, and that's the area where there are more people of Dutch descent than there are of English or anybody else. So not surprisingly, that's in New York and New Jersey, formerly parts of New Netherland. So still lots of Dutch people there, as of 1760, by the way. Then you've got these orange groups to the west. Along the western edge of the middle and southern colonies, the orange group are the Scots-Irish. Now, that does not mean people from Scotland and or people from Ireland. Scots-Irish is a specific type of people that we'll talk about in just a couple of minutes. So that's where they are. Now, finally, the areas that are this sort of bluish purple color, those are the areas where there are more people of African descent than there are English or anybody else. So that is obviously there in the south, in the area there of Virginia, some small spots there in North Carolina, but then a big spot in South Carolina down into Georgia. Areas where, in fact, people of African descent not only outnumbered the English, but as you got further south in those concentrated areas, they outnumbered any European group of people. All right, remember this map, particularly the orange parts with the Scots-Irish. But for now, let's take a look at a nice pie chart to help us visualize that in a different way, divided by percentage of the colonial population as of 1775, who were of these various ethnic groups. Now, not surprisingly, the biggest one is English. These are the English colonies, after all. But I at least do find it a little surprising that in the English colonies, slightly less than half the people were actually English or of English descent. Just a little bit below, 48.7%. Next largest group is African, 20%. Now this is through all 13 colonies. That means that on the eve of the American Revolution, 1/5 of the colonial population was of African descent. And out of that 20%, I would guess that about 90% or 90 to 95% were slaves, with a smaller number of free black people. Then the next largest group, Scots-Irish, there 7.8%, German, and then actual Scottish they make a dent there. Then Dutch, small number of French people, mostly up in New England. People who, in the part of Massachusetts that was then known as Maine, had a lot of people who spoke French who had formerly, they or their grandparents, been part of the French colony up there. And then a tiny sliver there, 0.4% looks like, of Swedish people. They were what was left there in that colony of New Sweden. And then other, which is everybody else all put together. Now, they got the Scots-Irish mentioned here, and they've got the Scottish mentioned here. They don't have the Irish. That means that actual people of Irish descent from Ireland made up a smaller percentage than people whose ancestry was Swedish at this time. All right, well, let's take a broader look and compare those colonies to the others. We've seen maps similar to this a couple of times that show the territories of the different colonial powers. So the French territory in North America was divided into two colonies, Louisiana to the south and Nouvelle-France, or New France, to the north. And then you got the 13 colonies, that narrow band of red, which, and we've mentioned this before, I think, the English possession is much, much smaller so far as land mass, so far as geography. It's just a fraction of what French powers controlled. Yet look at the population. In that whole huge area controlled by France, there were only 15,000 French people, 15,000 colonists. Now, of course, this number isn't counting the Native Americans. In those 13 colonies, that's just a fraction the size of the French colonies, 250,000 colonists, 250,000 people. And that number, I believe, is including the slaves, but not including Native Americans. Then the area controlled by New Spain, which is basically Florida, the American West, Mexico, Central America, and almost all of South America. That's somewhere between 5 and 7 million people. But in the North America part, the Spanish didn't have nearly that many. So those English colonies have a huge amount of people concentrated in them, and that's because, as we've discussed before, the French were primarily after trade with the Indians. The English wanted those colonies as a place to get more land to send more English people, more settlers. All right, well, we've mentioned the Scots-Irish a couple of times, and I have hinted that they're not exactly the same thing as Scots or Irish. So let's take a look at exactly what they were. The people known as Scots-Irish came from the northern counties of Ireland, the region known as Ulster. So we'll come back to this map in a second. Here is a larger map of the British Isles. Ireland there is the smaller island that is green for the most part, and Ulster is colored that sort of a tan there. So those are the counties of Ulster. Ireland was subjugated by the English, just as Wales and Scotland had been. During the 16th century, the Protestant Reformation occurred. England became the Church of England under Henry VIII, the Anglican Church, as you know. Most of the people in Scotland also converted to Protestantism, but not to the Church of England for the most part. Most of them became Presbyterian, actually. That was the largest group, who were a Calvinist group, just as the Puritans were a Calvinist group. Well, people of Ireland did not. They did not become Protestant. They remained Roman Catholic. Now, late 1500s, 1580s, England found itself at war with Spain and also was frequently at war with France. So how does that line up religiously speaking? England is, Britain, as they later absorbed Scotland kind of into them. They were Protestant, but Spain was Catholic and France was Catholic. And religion played a huge role beyond just the usual national politics that led to those wars. So here's the issue. In 1588, the Spanish Navy, a vast armada, had attempted to cross the English Channel and invade England, but had been defeated and beaten back. The fear of the English was that the Spanish, who were Catholic, might try again, and instead of coming from that direction, they might go land in Ireland and use Ireland as a launching point, because they'd be close that way, and kind of have a sneak attack over to Scotland and northern England. So, in an effort to prevent that from happening, because there was fear that the Irish, who were repressed and dominated by the English and didn't like them very much, and who also happens to be Catholic, might side with the Catholic Spanish. It was decided that maybe it would be better if, at least there in that northern part, they weren't Catholic. Well, could not forcibly convert them and make it take in a short time. So what they did instead was England sent settlers to Northern Ireland, most of them from Scotland. So they'd come over, they had taken away a lot of this land through warfare, taken away and controlled the northern part of the island of Ireland, and opened it up to settlement to poorer people. And a lot of people from Scotland came over, and that was the idea, because they were Protestant. So those Protestant Scottish people now living in Northern Ireland, and all of a sudden displacing, by the way, the Catholic Irish who lived there and kind of driving them south. And then all of a sudden, Northern Ireland is Protestant. Now, this is called the Plantation of Ulster because they planted people. They planted Protestants in Ulster. So the red areas was part of the official plantation of Ulster that was sanctioned by the King of England. And then the orange were some areas that were done basically the same way, but through private enterprise. So, Scots-Irish people were Scottish people who moved to Northern Ireland. So they're now Irish because they live in Ireland, but they're still Scottish, hence Scots-Irish. Now, many of them eventually immigrated across the Atlantic to the English colonies, to the 13 colonies. In some cases, they were people who had been born in Scotland and then moved to Ireland. And in some cases, perhaps they were the grandchildren or great-grandchildren of Scottish people who had moved to Ireland. So they themselves had not been born perhaps in Scotland, but born and raised in Ireland. But they had that Scottish heritage. So that's what Scots-Irish is. Because a lot of those Scots-Irish living in Northern Ireland still were not real well off financially and were willing to take a gamble on the New World. Another ethnic group that people today sometimes get confused about, the Pennsylvania Dutch. What's so confusing about them? The fact they're not Dutch. In fact, they are the descendants of immigrants from what is now Germany, who came over in the early 1700s in several waves from a German region called the Palatine, that is the modern German state of the Rhineland-Palatinate. There's on the left where this region is located in Germany, and there on the right is a blow-up version of the region with the Rhineland in the north and the Palatinate in the south. So why were there waves of immigrants from this particular region? A couple of reasons. Number one is that there was a lot of warfare going on in the early 1700s with neighboring France, and this is right on the border with France, and the French actually came into this region and took it over and displaced a lot of the inhabitants and brought in French people. So a lot of Germans from this area became refugees, and so they took a gamble on trying to make a life for themselves in the New World. And then another reason is that several, religious groups that had initially been known as Anabaptists, and which were quite a bit different from your typical Protestant groups, and were persecuted heavily, and later became divided into the groups known as the Mennonites and the Amish, because they were being persecuted. Several of the members of those groups had come down into the Palatinate and gathered together, and then from there they just left Germany and came to the U.S., mainly Pennsylvania. And when they arrived there, being to the English colonists what today we would refer to as dadgum foreigners, didn't speak English. Well, you don't speak English, what do you speak? And they told them that they speak Deutsch, because Deutsch is the German word for German. Hence, their English neighbors thought they were Dutch. But they were not. They were German. In fact, many of their descendants, particularly members of those religious groups, Amish and Mennonites, still speak German, although it is kind of a distinct form of German from what you will hear in any of the regions of Germany, because it's kind of blended together over time from several different German regions. And, is referred to as Pennsylvania Dutch, but that's the story behind that. All right. Well, now what we're going to do is we're going to take a different view of the people living in those 13 colonies. So we've looked at all the different types of immigrants, but essentially now we're going to divide it up by three groups, and that is the Native American people who were already there, and the Europeans who had shown up, and by now their descendants, and the African descended people. So we're going to take a look at each of those groups and kind of see where they were here in the early 1700s. And we're going to start with the Native American cultures. A lot of changes by the early 1700s that had occurred over the previous couple of centuries. For one thing, some of the tribes that we've already mentioned on here, like the Creek Confederacy, the Catawbas, the Choctaws, they didn't really exist in their present form when DeSoto came through in 1540. Those various groups were what are called coalescent groups, in which the survivors of a bunch of different tribes that virtually were wiped out by disease that came with DeSoto kind of grouped together to form new polities. So the Choctaws had 3 divisions, and that's a really a reflection of the fact that it was three different groups that came together, the survivors of three different groups. The Seminoles came later. They didn't exist at all. Um, their ancestors existed. They were Creek or Muskogee Indians, a group of which would become Seminole later on. Well, other big changes. Remember all that stuff we talked about native culture, about the need to preserve balance, and all those things about how to gain leadership by showing how much stuff you can give away and by showing, how much spiritual power that you have. All of those things started to change. The deerskin trade was really largely responsible for that, particularly after the Indian slave trade ended in the early 1700s after the Yamasee War. Then a lot of that trade was moved over to deerskins, and the ideal for native peoples was that you only take what you need. You try to preserve the balance, but once they got absorbed into this economic system, this trade system, and they became reliant upon the trade goods they were getting from the English, which they could only get by producing more furs, they started killing more and more deer, way more than they needed to survive, because now they're killing them just so that they can barter with their skins and buy stuff. The deer have ceased becoming an equal part of the balance of nature, equal with humans, and instead they have become commodities to be amassed and used. So that's a big change to native culture. Also, it's going to be a big change to the deer population, which by the end of the 1700s is going to be in danger of becoming extinct in the South because of overhunting, mostly from American Indians. Also, leadership, I mentioned that. It had always been, if you prove yourself a wise leader, you make good decisions, you prove your courage, and you have spiritual power, and you're a really good speaker, then people would follow you, and you would rise in leadership. But over the course of the 1700s, east of the Mississippi, where they're interacting with the English and also the French, that started to change because the Europeans would come along with trade goods that they would offer as gifts to the leaders that they talked with. And so those gifts, which might come in the form of jewelry even, or medallions, or suits of European clothes, cloaks and stuff like that, those became highly desired commodities among the Native Americans. And so the leaders who were getting that stuff from the Europeans, they weren't giving it away. They were keeping it. And how much stuff you had was starting to indicate how powerful you were and how much influence you had. In other words, they're becoming Europeanized across the board in all these different ways. And also, and we've seen a little of this already in our discussions, more and more Native American tribes are entering into alliances with the European colonial powers and being used by the European military, right? So the English hate the French, and the French hate the English, and they hate the Spanish, and they're always fighting, and they want to get your tribe to be on their side, and that means you have to fight their enemies. And so essentially, these tribes were becoming like an extension of the English military or the French military or the Spanish military. They were almost becoming like mercenaries. And all these were huge, huge changes away from the traditional way of doing things. Among the colonists, there was an increasing change pertaining to social class and to the stratification of society in both the southern colonies and the northern colonies. Now, the southern colonies had been more stratified from the beginning. They were a little bit more like the society in societies in Europe, but those northern colonies established by the Puritans had been a bit different. But by the 1700s, that's changing across the board as certain families throughout all the colonies accumulate large amounts of wealth, making them a sort of an aristocracy. This is particularly true in South Carolina, where the wealth was extraordinary and concentrated in the hands of even fewer people. Well, and of course, we talked about that. That's because those rice colonies, those rice plantations rather, were so extremely lucrative. And when we looked at that pyramid, remember, when particularly you have that aristocratic elite class, like the planter class was, they are deeply invested in social stability, in keeping that pyramid firmly in place. Now, there was also this phenomenon going on in the 1700s, wherein these wealthier colonists, most of whom had been born in the colonies, became more and more determined to outwardly display how English they were. This is the process I refer to in the bullet points as Anglicization. Essentially, if you've got a really wealthy family in South Carolina or in Boston or wherever it is, and on the social hierarchy there in that colony or that city, they're way high up, they still have kind of an inferiority complex because the rich people back in England look down on them because no matter how much money they have, they're still way out in the sticks, rather. They're hicks in the sticks, out there in some podunk colony, and are considered to be inferior to English proper society. So those elites in the colonies tried ever harder to fit into English society and show how English they were. And they would do this by doing things like, for example, making frequent trips to Europe, to England, and to the continent if they could afford it. And these are the people who could afford it, by sending their children on the tour as they come of age. That is a tour of Europe. Sending their children to schools in England rather than schools in the colonies. And just basically trying to make sure that they're on top of the latest fashions from London and Paris, and trying to shed this perception they had of themselves and that the English aristocracy had of them as being kind of backward and primitive. Meanwhile, as this social stratification is increasing, it also is going to have an effect on the people toward the bottom, the poor colonists, the poor white people. Poverty is increasingly viewed as evidence that somebody is lazy. They're lazy and undeserving, shiftless, that is to say, a ne'er-do-well, that they just don't, they're poor because they want to be, because they don't want to try hard enough. And so therefore they are a blight on society. Now these are the same types of attitudes that existed at this time and were hardening in England. So this led to the establishment of more and more poorhouses, also called an almshouse. I'm not sure about you, but my grandma used to say, "You keep eating so much, you're going to send me to the poorhouse." I didn't really know what that meant. The poorhouse, or the county house, sometimes it was called around here, was a place that you were sent if you were homeless, if you were indigent, if you were impoverished, that you were forced to go there and basically forced to labor there. and they were very, very difficult places to live in. They were designed, really, to punish people for being poor. And there was also this practice that was called warning out, so that if you were traveling along and you traveled into a new town and people suspected you of coming into their town without much money, therefore potentially becoming a drain on them, if you couldn't produce evidence that you had a certain amount of money on you, you were declared indigent, and basically you were told in no uncertain terms, you have to leave our town. You can't stay here. You have to get out now, and they'd be chased out. Now, meanwhile, the people in the middle, they weren't ridiculously wealthy, and they weren't totally impoverished. People there in that middle strata began more and more over the course of the 1700s to have this view of land, that owning land, was a basic, fundamental right that everyone, unless they were a lazy, poor, shiftless person, should have. Now, this is totally different from the views of non-wealthy people in England back in the 1500s and early 1600s when the colonists first started to come over. The land belongs to the aristocracy. But there's this increasing idea that just the average colonist deserves to have land. And how do you get this land? You keep going westward and killing Indians to take it away from them. So that's where we are so far as the socioeconomic situation in the colonies in the 18th century. So we've looked at the Native Americans, we've looked at the colonists. Now let's look at the African American community, both slave and free.